On today's episode, I have a very special guest. He's Sean Linehan, Managing Director for the UK operations of Blue Helion. A very warm welcome to the show, Sean.
Thank you. And yeah, I'm really pleased to be here. I'm excited to do this. Actually, my third podcast on a topic that is very much top of my mind, and it would seem top of mind in the industry.
You have about 25 plus years experience across sales leadership, mergers and acquisitions. One of our favorite topics is around sales and leadership.
Hmm.
So we'll start from there.
Yeah, sure.
You've taken three teams in 5 years from 70 to 110% achievement using a methodology that identifies and enhances growth performance. So, can you spill some of the secrets around this?
Well, you want me to give away all my secrets? That's going to put me at a distinct disadvantage. I think, in all seriousness, Kaushik, there are probably three key things that I've managed to focus on. It's all about people, ultimately. If you're in a sales or marketing leadership role, you're going to need to get things done through and with people. And I've found that if you hire, train, and attempt to retain the very best people that you can, remove obstacles from their way, and also that includes ourselves sometimes as well, because we can be in a leadership position guilty of getting in the way too often. Hire the best people you can and move yourself out of the way, remove the obstacles that undoubtedly will exist in some, specifically in some larger organizations. Give the people the smoothest surface that they can work on, and then be there when they need you to support them. By that, I mean really, really high quality people and high performance people. They benefit from guide rails, a bit like when you go 10-pin bowling, you have the bumper guides up to stop the ball falling in the gutter. High performance people don't really like other people to know that there's a framework around them, but they actually benefit from it. And I've found that the the looser you can keep that and the lower the fence or the guide rail, the better people perform. Really high performance people actually benefit from a little bit of management. They may not always like to admit it, but I have certainly found that they benefit from it. The other thing that I would always focus on is vision. Have a vision that all of the teams can buy into. Make sure that you've achieved an alignment across all of your functions. You don't have to necessarily have everybody agree with you. In fact, I think it's often healthy to have a bit of disagreement, but you must all align around the direction we're going and the goals that we're pursuing. And then I think thirdly is targets. Everybody must know what they're responsible for, what they're accountable for, and how they will be measured and how those results or otherwise will be communicated. I think an open and transparent communication and sharing of those measurements and the results is critical. Sometimes some people are a little unnerved if they're underperforming, but I think it's the sales leader's role or the marketing leader's role to have the discussion the minute they start to see an indicator that's starting to lag behind the broader population and do what they can to adjust or correct it. Or in extreme circumstances, they have the option to remove those people from the team. It doesn't always mean that you have to remove them, but I think it's important that if there is chronic underperformance and you're unable to adjust it, then I think it's the best thing for all parties to part. But you do that professionally and make sure that the people you're taking out of the business have got a place of safety to go to. Just because they're not working out for you doesn't mean they won't work out for somebody else. And I think that we take people out of the business with care and they land somewhere else with care.
I'm a big fan of Gary Vee. And one of the things that he keeps talking about is hire fast, fire faster,
Yes.
and promote fastest. I have also seen many founders being wary of actually letting someone go, or on the other hand, probably taking a 3 month cycle just to hire someone.
Yeah, I think the promote faster is an interesting one. A lot of founders are reticent to promote people for fear of having them suddenly they were two layers below them, now they're one layer beneath them, and then actually they become a peer. And a lot of founders aren't ready for that. But that's the growth journey the founder has to go on to determine their own level of self-awareness to say, what got us here was me and the skills I had. What's going to get us to the next level is somebody else likely. And I find that
True.
truly self-aware leaders can actually do that. Those that don't hold people back and they wonder why they churn and burn high quality performant people by just not promoting them quickly enough. The fire fast is an interesting concept. I can only really talk to the UK although I have some European experience, it isn't always
Mhm.
easy to fire fast here. But I think if you create the right environment at the outset, set the expectations very, very clearly, and manage them, then you can take people back out of the business quickly and safely for all parties. But you do need to be on top of your game.
Makes sense. So you are a fellow IBMer, and I know that you're a big fan of the flywheel concept of Jim Collins, which is mentioned in the book Good to
Yes.
Great. So I would absolutely love to hear more about how you're helping clients with this methodology and approach in Blue Helion.
Yeah, so I had the great pleasure of seeing Jim Collins present at a Cognos event in Dallas, in Texas. And I have to say, it was probably about 90 minutes of the most edge of seat conversation that I've ever witnessed. It was a full auditorium, about 1,000 field sales and marketing people in a darkened auditorium in Dallas. And he came onto the stage, it was all dark, and there was just one light on him. And it was brilliant. And his articulation of the momentum that's required and the effort to get that flywheel moving is enormous. But you've got to apply yourself in the right areas to get that flywheel moving. And then once it's moving, all effort must be applied to maintaining and accelerating the speed at which the flywheel turns. I see so many organizations focusing on a myriad of things and wondering why the flywheel is barely moving at all, let alone turning. And one of the things that I get people to really focus on, specifically at the moment, is to understand what are the things that move the flywheel and what are the things that we can do to accelerate it. And you'll find those in your people, your processes, the technology that you use, your customers, the messaging that you take out to the market, and also the messaging that comes back in and what you do with it. So for me, it's critical that organizations have an understanding or a layer of KPIs that they can rely upon to say these efforts make the flywheel move, these ones don't. Remove as best you can the ones that don't, and really get your team to focus on how do we move this flywheel forward? Should we be going after the massive clients in our market, or should we go after a smaller subset of slightly smaller organizations? The response that you'll get to that will be different based on their visions and their plans, etc. But for me, it's critical to really know that. And he has another concept in his book about know you're a hedgehog. You know what you are to your market and
Right.
be all you can to them in that market. Again, that level of focus, that level of understanding and awareness starts to put momentum behind the flywheel. But anybody who really understands the concept of a flywheel, if you imagine an enormous stone wheel that stood static on an axle, the amount of effort just to get it to move an inch is akin to a startup. You've got no customers, you've got perhaps some funding behind you that are breathing down your neck to get you to get things done, and you apply yourself to lots of things and the wheel doesn't move. Whereas narrow your focus, align to the vision, and then do all you can to move that flywheel, move your argument, your debate, or your hypothesis into the market, have the market tell you you're right or wrong, and then act upon it. But yeah, spread yourself too thin, you'll never move it. And even if you do, you'll find it's incredibly exhausting. And quarter after quarter, you will think, cracky, there has to be an easier way. And it's my belief that there is actually an easier way, but you do need to be focused.
You've been in the M&A for quite a while, so we will delve deeper. But
Mm.
on a very broad level, why should a company go for inorganic growth?
Yeah. So, as somebody who, for the first probably 20 years of their corporate life, lived the organic life, and it is akin to being on a hamster wheel. You can run as fast as you like, but you're not getting anywhere really. You might achieve the goals, but actually, are you further forward? Not always. For me, the concept of organic growth is challenging, and I understand why lots of organizations just go for organic growth. But I happen to believe that given the opportunity, you could choose the inorganic route and buy organizations or acquire organizations and bolt them into where you are, taking potentially years out of your growth journey and applying much, much more value to your organization, not just from a valuation perspective, but to your customers and to your people as well. So I think all organizations would benefit from at least exploring what is available to us in the inorganic space. If you're a founder looking for a planned exit in 5 to 10 years, and you go down the organic route. My suggestion is every couple of years you'll realize you're just adding another couple of years to the exit point. Whereas if you were to take the inorganic and the acquisition route, you would
Mhm.
accelerate significantly. I had a conversation with a founder just a couple of weeks ago where I asked him the question, given the opportunity, would you choose to start up the way you did before, or would you do something differently? And he said, there's no way you would get me to do a startup again. I would go and buy an organization, then buy another one, and maybe bolt the two and more together.
Revenue generation is a very key point or an aspect with M&As. But what are
Yes.
the other critical points that an acquiring company should be looking for in their target company?
Yeah, so there's that word that gets bandied around about synergies, technology, process, etc. Can we save cost by removing head office number two and just centralizing all of our operations? Those are important things to look at. I genuinely believe that. But for me, you need to focus on culture. You need to focus on post-merger or post-acquisition integration and look for areas where you can really continue to accelerate whilst you bring these other people or other teams into your business. A focus just on revenue, I think, is a distraction. Revenue is interesting, profit is much more interesting, and cash flow even more. They're key things. But also, where are the two organizations more alike than they're different? And really bring some focus into those areas, because that will give you the accelerant around culture, and then you're not losing valuable people in terms of your own people, but you're also not losing customers as well. And really make sure that you can focus your offering as best you can into the new set of customers that you're acquiring, so that you get out further, faster, but also you've achieved a set sense of scale with your offering inside your own customer set, rather than having to go and acquire new customers organically. I don't know whether that
True.
answers or addresses the entire question.
Absolutely, but that raises a follow-up question.
I thought it
So
might.
you were mentioning around the culture,
Mm.
and interestingly, you mentioned about Cognos as well. I was with IBM when we acquired Cognos,
Mm.
and on the flip side, I was with Business Objects when they got acquired by SAP a few months before.
Right.
So I've been on both sides of the table, and what I noticed is they tend to reduce the headcount, and it's usually the frontline team. So keeping in mind that the acquisition is actually happening to increase revenues,
Mm.
because that is something that is primarily to do with owning the relationship with the client. So how does one really take care of the culture?
Yeah, and this is probably the single most difficult part of any post-merger or acquisition integration. And like you, I was at IBM, so I'd left Cognos 2 years prior to
Okay.
IBM making the acquisition, and at the time it was IBM's largest acquisition at $5 billion. And I
Yes.
watched with some dismay practical dismantling of Cognos. And I get why, because you're bringing a relatively small organization into a massive company. I think there were about 400,000 employees at
True.
IBM when that acquisition took place. And the culture was, you'll fit in or you probably won't be here. Now, whilst it wasn't used, that narrative wasn't expressly used, but that's essentially what it felt like for a lot of my colleagues and friends coming in from Cognos. They felt like they'd just been sucked into this enormous machine, weren't all
True.
made to feel welcome, and the cultures could not have been more different. The culture at Cognos was very collegiate. Some people would describe it almost like a family. Of course, it wasn't a family, but it felt very friendly. It felt like you were taken care of. And that's not to say that IBM didn't take care of its people, because it absolutely did. But there was a very different culture, still performance driven, but the two cultures had a moment of collision. And I'm not sure that IBM, on reflection, got it right. In fact, I know that there would be people who would tell you they didn't get it right. The focus should be, from my perspective, and I can only speak to slightly smaller acquisitions. My level of expertise doesn't extend to 5 billion yet acquisitions. But where I find the most focus is understand, as I said earlier, where your people are most alike. Where are the areas? And there are always pockets where you can see that you're more alike than you are different. Bring those people together as quickly as you can and try to meet in the middle rather than having them come over to your side. Off sites are brilliant for this, neutral zones where you can bring people together and learn about the cultures, learn about what it was that made, in this example, Cognos really successful, and then help the Cognos people understand what it is about IBM that makes it so successful. Ultimately, you're selling technology to customers who want to get further ahead. The culture and style of selling wasn't wildly different, but it was just the way it was managed, the way performance was managed was different. IBM is or was a very tightly managed organization. Cognos was tightly managed, but it was nowhere near as maniacally focused on day-to-day measurement of performance. I recall 8 a.m. calls and then 6 p.m. calls on the same day every day at IBM. I'm not sure that level of cadence actually improved anything other than, well, I can't think of a single thing it did improve. Cognos was not like that. So I think focus on the people, focus on where you're more alike, and really do all you can to ensure that the people you need most are the ones who feel most welcome first, and then have that percolate out across the organization that you're acquiring. I can still recall that acquisition and the subsequent integration. A lot of people did leave. There were some who were genuinely very, very excited about the potential opportunity that IBM offered them. Whether it was ever realized, I don't know.
I think it was 2010 Jan or something, the acquisition was announced. Yeah. And it was a time when startups also were not as common, say, as it is today. Since I've spent a lot of time with startups, there are many founders who like to micromanage. And this is something I've been seeing continuously, at least in India. They love to micromanage. So 2 cadences a day. I want you to be sitting in the office. When you are advising for an M&A, are these things that you actually delve into? Because these will be further down. Or is it that these kind of discussions also happen?
So it's a really valid point, actually. So I try to introduce that conversation at the very outset so that it's a seed that's sown that will grow as the acquisition matures, as you move towards the eventual signing and closing of the deal. The reason I like to sow that seed in the founders' minds early is because you're going to have that discussion. And it's better that it's had an opportunity to grow inside their mind over a period of time. A fast acquisition here in the UK would take 90 days minimum. Typically, 6 to 9 months, 12 months is not out of the ordinary. So if you leave it till the very end, then what we see is those founders doing exactly as you just described, micromanaging the new people who clearly weren't used to that before. And then they rail against it, and then you lose the asset that you actually hoped to acquire. So I think it's really key that I certainly get them to focus on, are you ready, Mr. Founder, CEO, to think about new people who might be joining your organization that might be as good, if not better than you? What environment will you create and exist within when that happens? What do you need to know about yourself now in order to prepare for that? And might there be a situation, or might it be true, that actually you might move aside and allow someone who's better than you to take it to the next level? I'll tell you now, it's an uncomfortable conversation 9 times out of 10, because of course they've taken the bold step, they've assumed all of the risk and some of the money as well, and they've got it to where it is. I think it's important as advisors, especially paid advisors, that we have that discussion early on so that they're prepared for it, and we can start to be a good counsel, a good sounding board to share with them where there might be some gaps in their self-awareness, that actually if we can achieve an uplift in that when the acquisition closes, they've already begun to build or at least engineer an environment where high quality people can land and actually feel valued. Sorry to labour the point, Kaushik. The micromanagement, I think, comes from either a lack of understanding of what it really takes to sell, and without wishing to take anything away from the founders, quite often a lot of the early sales, especially in startups, a lot of the early sales are founder network led. So they have sometimes a bit of an overinflated estimation of their actual ability and actually what it takes to sell. And I certainly see that quite a lot. And that mindset really focuses on micromanagement. They have to know exactly how many phone calls, how many meetings, why you're in the office, what you're doing in the office, how many days you're in the office. And for me, they're interesting metrics, so you can perform some analysis on that. But actually, what is it we're trying to get done here? And does this level of an analysis or introspection, does it actually move, talking about the flywheel, are we moving the flywheel, or are we just busying ourselves because we've got some data points that tell us something?
Just a hypothetical case. So if I'm a startup founder and I'm trying to build a company with the intention to getting acquired, should I be going after the elephants or the large customers, the big names? Is that something that really entices the acquirer? Or should I go rather like for the deer, which are like more SMB customers, run rate, so on?
It's probably one of the most asked questions I hear from people who are moving through from startup into scale up. But I'll answer your specific question, startups. Honestly, Kaushik, I think it depends on what your exit plan looks like. Mm-hmm. But I will tell you this, if you have a hyper dependency upon one or two very large, typically complex clients, whilst at the outset that might look really good because the revenues look particularly good, one of those moves away and you will spend a long time backfilling the revenue or profit gap or cash flow gap that then creates. So from a external acquisition perspective, if we say all things are equal, revenue, profit and cash flow, which one is the most attractive? I think having a slightly better spread, lower churn and lower dependency on one or two would make you more appealing, but perhaps not necessarily adjusting or affecting the valuation too massively.
And is this different in case of a scale-up?
So from a scale-up perspective, what we see is quite often there's a long tail starting to emerge where they have customers that exhibit some of the attributes that would align them to being the ideal customer profile. What we see is having the discussions with founders to say, at some point it's going to be better to sever the tail so that you can then discard those and refocus your efforts on creating more of the ideal customers. So those that pay on time, use more of your services, will come to you for additional support and services and have longer service engagements with you. That, I think, is the difference with the scale up. So you might go after, for example, say a government contract, but I wouldn't say only have one or two of those. I would have a section of, for example, in this example, a government contract, and then some private sector organisations that are perhaps slightly lower in terms of their revenue values, but you've got a better spread that ultimately makes the whole more valuable.
My final question is, again, from an acquirer perspective. I have seen quite a few companies trying to do it on their own. In India, for example, we've seen Byju's going on an absolute acquisition spree and now doldrums. So how critical is it that a person who's going for an M&A should actually hire a consultant or somebody who can help them with the due diligence and then take this forward?
Yeah, that's a very important point, actually, because hire a consultant too early and you're just going to be paying lots. And in my experience, I tend to shy away from those ones because they just keep moving to the right and the client is happy, they think, until it gets to a point where they're not happy. My suggestion would be that you hire the advice you need as you need it, or just ahead of when you need it, and then terminate when you no longer need it. So don't go and hire a CFO, a fractional CFO, for the entire due diligence. Assemble the data points that you need, make sure that it's complete, and then have an expert run the rule over it. Have your operations person or your lawyer engaged at the point where there's reason to invest the money or the fees that are ultimately going to be required to take you forward, and be really, really clear about what it is expressly that you want as an outcome from that engagement. So I think all too often I see medium-sized organizations bringing in external advisors and teams when it's really not necessary, and it becomes a big distraction. And when they do that, I see the timeline to closure extending out. Ultimately, if you're the founder of a startup or a scale up and you're looking to acquire another organization, it's about two people initially that share a common view of the world that they want to inhabit. The more work you can do together, and you'll be surprised, legally, you can achieve an awful lot down the due diligence road without engaging legal services, without engaging financial accountants, etc. If you're acquiring, you ought to be able to understand and interpret the due diligence to a level that it makes some sense for the deal at least to proceed, and then you bring the experts in to make sure that the valuation that you're going to put on your heads of terms, etc., and your letter of intent, that these things actually stack up, and then you move through the final stages of due diligence. There's probably more that we could get into, but I think that gives you a real flavour. You can remove years of pain and challenge if your view is that you want to exit your organisation by taking the inorganic route. It's certainly a big passion of mine. Right now, there are a lot of organisations with motivated sellers and founders that are looking for a route out, sometimes not always to leave the business, but just no longer to be in charge of the business. So I would encourage those organisations that are thinking about how they're going to achieve 2024's growth and explore the potential for an additional acquisition into their strategy. Typically see at the end of March, that's when we're going to start to see people really thinking about how are we going to achieve this year's growth now we're 1 quarter in.
Sean, thanks so much for having taken the time out.
My pleasure. Thank you.